The project I've been working on is more or less a researcher around the fields of design and posthumanism. Started when I did my master's thesis at Harvard, analyzing the film Blade Runner, which I was young enough to have to sneak in to see illegally. And I was obsessed at that time with the idea of infrastructural thought and the extension of mobile sections and spaces that could, in some ways, proliferate across territories almost to the planetary scale. So very early in my career, I was very interested in these extreme, not just environments, but this fantasy of the infinitely extendable infrastructure, which has come back with a vengeance in the Anthropocene as almost like a cargo cult fantasy that some infrastructure will save us at some point too. So that's like the seeds of it. And I also work in a field I call architectural intelligence, as having a background in architecture, looking specifically at different knowledge systems, particularly the ones that cross between or fall between the cracks of disciplines, the infradisciplinary as opposed to interdisciplinary, around different types of art science practices, and particularly those disciplines that tend towards diagrammatic notation, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I want to talk about the research proposal that I've been developing, which is right now an overdue book proposal for Springer, India. I'm here in India, looking at the idea of the posthuman apparatus and dwelling on, for a few minutes here, traditional apparatus theory, framing posthumanism perhaps more in a Deleuzian notion coming from Rosi Berdatti and some of the people working in the Netherlands in the previous decade, trying to establish, I guess, neutering of the prefix post and playing with variations of everything from more than human to, in many ways, the kind of chimeric mutant situations all of us find ourselves having to operate in increasingly. When I've taught doctoral research methods courses, I often ask students to develop not a methodology per se, but a methodology machine, a device that produces a methodology as opposed to just having a ready-made methodology. In some ways in design, we have meta design. There's very few designers, as you know, will design particular artifacts anymore. We design processes that design multiplicities of different types of artifacts. And in this way, I'm also intrigued with the possibility of, again, hybrid systems displacing perhaps an old post-structuralist fantasy of the human-centered design into something that takes us into the realm that is much more esoteric, imaginary, catonic, or in some ways unexpected. The pivot point has always been the Enlightenment and this bird cage of the soul that I guess what Feyerabend called the rodents of positivism, driving everything down to the most reproducible, testable, knowable, lowest common denominator, and fighting against that too. On the right, you can see, for example, Diderot's mapping of human cognition, and you can see that puny little thing hanging there like a fossilized appendix represents the imagination. So I think this is the realm that also needs to be further elaborated, in some ways, in evolutionary terms, mutated back into the conversation around a possible post-industrial world. For this, we look at a lot of examples. For example, this Beasley's projects, he's using recycled syringes and medical apparatuses to make devices, they're installations that are partially sculpture, partially environmental, not quite sentient, but certainly not static either, playing at the edges of, say, the boundaries of bio-art, installation art, and creative adaptive use of some of the toxic plasticity that is swarming around the world. I want to talk a little bit about apparatus theory. It's a very formative part of my development as well. Learning film theory as a young architecture student, and Baudry writing with the Telequel group, very interested in psychoanalytics and semiotics in the 70s and trying to find deeper meanings in the structure, the recognition, the ideology embedded in the lenses and the perspectival systems of apparatuses per se. But also the idea that it talked about the idea of arrangement, that apparatus theory had to do often with everything from mechanized scenes to automatic processes operating beneath the level of consciousness. And I think this is an interesting realm that I've been quite fascinated with, even doing work earlier on surrealism, on those things that we don't know that we know. Apparatus represented both machines and technology in Baudry's theory. It also operated in the type of spectacle, meaning the board, but also the performative aspects of apparatus, but also as an ideology. So an apparatus itself in 1970s theory already has almost a chimeric structure itself of having three very different thought systems encoded into the casing of the devices. I'll just let you look at some of these points from his essay on apparatus. And also think about the apparatus in terms of, for example, this structure. I encountered this almost by accident at a Venice Biennale. Damian Ortega, a Mexican artist, has taken the most common device you find in Mexico City, the Volkswagen Beetle, and displayed it hanging in perfect exploded axonometric, although it's a perspectival object. In some ways, talking about not only the recombinant imagination that designers would use to think what are some other ways you could recombine these pieces when you do with it, but also quite liberally the idea of suspension and calling apart the process of making by delaminating physical objects to reveal not just their structures, but if we think in terms of apparatus theory, the spectacle embedded, the ideology embedded, as well as the actual, techne itself. Here it's a very hard type of cosmic apparatus, but there are soft apparatuses, soft machines operating in and around these, and in many ways like this invisible support systems or puppet strings in search of puppets that seem to connect like tendrils between unrelated aspects of technological determinism. I mentioned before an interest in diagrams. I often teach and use diagrams as a way of coding and decoding across different disciplines, subdisciplines, territories, or temporalities. And this is a work in progress of a diagram of diagrams showing the evolution of diagram thinking in the design fields from, again, the early 70s and the radicalization of film theory up until the early 2000s, where the diagrams function in a Deleuzian way as an abstract machine, something that, again, is a representation of representation, but avoids any of the saturations that would come from any sort of high-res or low-res explicit representation, dealing much more with questions of operations and procedures happening at the cognitive or unthought level, the precognitive. We also, in some recent works I've been working on, looking at apparatus theory as it relates to the machinic unconscious, Guattari's contribution after the Thousand Plateaus and the Capitalism and Schizophrenia project. Here we see a very simple chart explaining some of the terminology that allows us to pick apart determinist stable structures and to reveal through transversal, diagonal, or you might say abductive logic types of micro operations, ways of restabilizing or destabilizing what is seen as determinist structures and the persistence of the object in favor of things that are much closer towards process ontology. As you can see, things that are always in a state of becoming or transformation, no sense of arrival, but this kind of nomadic reiteration of different points of intensity, some remote, some proximate. And in the research that I've been working on, looking particularly at cinematic examples, I'm just going to call out three time skippers, as opposed to reality shifters, time skippers, films that very explicitly talk about devices or artifacts that allow us to move in time in a way that moves outside of mechanical time and subjective time. So first one's 12 Monkeys, and this is a little bit of a parody showing some of the debates happening in the relativity versus quantum mechanics understanding of the world. And 12 Monkeys is a very formative Terry Gilliam film, very incredibly clever, architecturally trained Monty Python-esque film director, looking at, in that case, the technology for time travel for Bruce Willis was not very clear, but he was allowed to see his own death, something we also see in Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, as a way of bringing maybe folds of time back on top of each other. A different example, and something I think much more relevant to the research that I've been doing, time skip in Arrival, where the actual language itself is the device, not the weapon, but the device that allows time to start to be manipulated and people to skip forward and backwards in time. Again, this one has been broken into 12 pieces very significantly and distributed to different places of the world, so people have to work together to make the fully functioning language a time machine in compliance with the foresight of the heptapods who said in 10,000 years the humans will help the heptapods. And then perhaps the most literal example in Tenet, where you have the future declaring war on the present and some of the bullets flying in reverse and the chronotopes moving in almost like two dual cones intersecting, where the algorithm that determines this is broken into physical artifacts and distributed not in space, but in this case across different time periods within history. And so the plot and the story become palindromes or mirrors of each other. And then just to talk about where that's taking my research now is looking at an idea of alien duration. It's a term that I think Nick Land used, but I want to use it in a very different way, coming with, say, Bogos's idea of alien phenomenology, and what would it be to have different types of machinic unconscious and different types of techno systems, extensive infrastructures that are operating both in and through, but far outside of human consciousness or even the project of rationalism per se. So to talk about duration very quickly, this is a diagram from Alfred Gell in his book Art and Autonomy, where there is no art, that all artists are basically occult technicians, taking a diagram from Edmund Husserl, who is obsessed as a phenomenologist with the notion of time consciousness, which I think, and many others think too, is actually the first real accurate model of the unconscious, devoid of any Oedipal or Freudian or sexual content, but the subconscious in many ways being the embedded, as you can see, retentions and protensions of time moving forward and backwards in this lattice or this array system. Talk about Bergson for a second, the idea of Bergson's cone of subjectivity, which reminds me a lot of a record stylus, and this might have something to do with some of the sound lab technicians too, where you have the past, your memories pulsing and pushing you into a point of absolute pure immanence of the moment, and then the future becoming this virtual extension, a different cone that's being astralized across a temporal dimension, as well as you can see, spatial dimensions too. You can think of this as like two little alligator teeth pinching something together, two chopsticks holding something. One of the posthuman apparatus approaches I'm interested in, what happened if there's a whole jaw of crocodile teeth and not just one simple point of pure subjectivity. This would obviously cause some sort of duration to become divergent or deranged, to pull apart any expectations of linear sequence, chronology, influence, or causality. Maybe not in the way that Jung imagined in synchronicity, a secret code being revealed, but maybe something more like radical entropy that takes you to a change of state that is so radically different that, the upside down in Stranger Things, that you completely lose your bearings, and in many ways you get lost in a different alien duration. When I teach this to students, I often have them go to the film Inception. Most of them have seen it, and it plays with their heads, but the idea of multiple durations is laid out very explicitly there in terms of the time sequences and the layering, almost like pools of time embedded within each other. And underneath all of them, a deeply structured, in many ways, formidable limbo, representing the bottoms of the consciousness or even the bottom of the unconscious. And just in conclusion, not the Cthulhu scene that we've talked about, or the Lovecraftian cosmism and anti-humanism, but maybe working towards this idea of the posthuman apparatus is also an opportunity for liberation of certain irrational tendencies that in the 20th century were often done in a reciprocating mechanism to the advances of the machine age, as a provocation for everything from playfulness to absurdity to become welcome and at home in both human and posthuman technology. And just last advertisement, I'm hoping to teach a course in December online here in India, where we're going to teach the students to make Jugaad time machines. Jugaad is the Hindi term for slapdash, kludged, or in many ways illegally tampered with, but still somehow operational time machines with found objects and things of that nature. So I'm going to try to test this through some physical artifacts and prototyping for my students. And with that, I will stop my share and stop my presentation. And that's where I am right now, hopefully getting a book proposal out in the next couple of months. Thank you.